Stephen Barrett is here. Stephen, very good morning to you.
Morning, Mike.
Now, you're the man to sort this mess out, obviously. We're going to get a statement, we understand, from the government. It's not clear whether it's going to be made by Keir Starmer in the House of Commons this afternoon on what they say will be a ruling on the definition of a woman. The original statement said that they would make a statement on gender recognition, which leads me to believe that Keir Starmer, who's obviously struggling with this because he hasn't said anything for 6 days, they may be leaning on trying to sort of bend it a little bit or something.
Well, I don't really think that they can, and I don't want to get too complicated.
Yeah.
But I want your listeners and viewers to understand 2 ideas.
Yeah.
The first is that generally Parliament can overturn any court ruling. Generally.
Yeah.
But that's within what we call the limits of the law. And some things are outside the power of the law. So the law, Parliament, cannot pass a law saying that gravity doesn't exist. If it does that, gravity will obviously carry on existing. And so that law should be struck down for what we call irrationality.
Yes.
And should be said to be not a law, because you can't have laws purporting to do the impossible. And the gender recognition laws got very close to being impossible. The Supreme Court has defined them and clarified them so that they aren't doing that. They aren't claiming to do the impossible, which is to swap somebody's sex, which cannot be done. So the law has been clarified in the right way, if you like.
Yes.
And everything's been made an awful lot clearer for organisations. And thank goodness, the period of confusion is now over. If Keir Starmer wants to try and challenge the Supreme Court, then I'm going to have to come out pretty guns blazing and saying he can't.
Yeah.
Because we cannot have irrational laws. We cannot have laws that purport to do things that Parliament simply can't do. We can't have a law saying that cats are now dogs. We can't have a law saying that the moon will be in Swanage tomorrow.
Yeah.
Because it won't.
Right.
We are bound. We are, as though we are sophisticated creatures who can run a complicated society.
Yes.
And we can govern ourselves however we want. But we are bound within the laws of physics. We are bound within the laws of reality, whether we like it or not. And unfortunately, this entire topic and entire debate was getting far too close to simply being irrational.
Yes. But I guess the bigger question, in a way, is not necessarily... I mean, I'm very interested in how the government is going to try and finesse this, because I think they will try and finesse it in some way, because they'll want to assuage those who disagree with it. But I also wonder what would happen in the case of, say, hospitals. We're told that several hospitals, I think there's more than a dozen hospital trusts in London alone, are going to sort of ignore the new law, and they're going to claim exemptions for trans women in certain spaces, for example, in female-only wards or in female-only toilets. And if they do that, presumably they're breaking the law, and what's going to be the result of that?
Well, exactly. I think perhaps out of a desire to be kind or a confusion, people are going to break the law and get themselves in all sorts of trouble.
Yeah.
I mean, what has happened is there is no new law. The Supreme Court clarified the law for those who were confused. I mean, I honestly don't see how the case could possibly have gone any other way than how it has. It means that in 99.9% of the time, single-sex spaces are very likely to be lawful. There's a schedule in the Equality Act that explains when that is. One of those points specifically mentions hospitals. Hospitals are a space where we do need single-sex spaces, and the term men, Mike,
Yes.
includes men and trans women. And that's whether they have a GRC or not. And that was made very clear. That's in paragraph 236 of the Supreme Court judgment. There should be no doubt now, hospitals who need to, and most hospitals will, provide single-sex spaces, must provide single-sex spaces. And we now know, if we were confused before, we now know what sex means.
Now, I spoke to Baroness Hater yesterday in the House of Lords, and I brought this up with her, and she said, well, the thing is, the hospitals haven't really had time to find a third space. They haven't really been able to do anything yet because it was only ruled on Wednesday. I don't see that as in any way an excuse for them to carry on as they like, to carry on as if nothing's changed.
No, and it's absolutely not. And you get a lot of mealy-mouthed words. Even I think the Education Secretary this morning was saying something about she might need to put out some guidance. We don't need yet more words. We've got clarity of law, okay? So everybody must simply now follow the law. And that means that you have to provide single-sex spaces in a variety of situations. And that's because they're necessary for the functioning of our society. That's because that's what the law says. And you don't get any real defense to that. You don't get to say, oh, I haven't had long enough to think this through. To be perfectly honest, Mike, I really do question the honesty of anybody who says that they haven't had long enough to think this through.
Yeah.
I've known all my life what a man and a woman are.
Right.
And babies know it almost instantaneously. It's not terribly tricky. And the idea that you might in some circumstances need to provide single-sex spaces doesn't strike me as particularly shocking. They don't include people from the opposite sex.
Right.
It's that simple. And no, Mike, they're not going to be able to get out of it. They're not going to be able to whine. No amount of guidance from the government will change anything. When I said that if the government wants to act, it has to use Parliament. Anything other than using Parliament will be completely ineffective.
But,
as I warned, Mike, as I flagged, if they do use Parliament to try and reverse this, I think the court should strike that down if it's irrational.
Yes. But is there a decriminalisation sort of aspect to this as well? Rather like, say, for example, with the cannabis laws, essentially it's illegal to smoke a joint and walk down the street. But very rarely does anybody actually get arrested for it. Similarly, if you're a trans woman and you decide to walk into a women's toilet in a pub or in a restaurant or something, what's going to be the penalty? Who's going to police it?
Well, we need to get thinking about the rule of law again. And this government in particular, when it was in opposition, it would cry the rule of law left, right and centre.
Oh, yeah.
Chris Bryant, who's a minister, I think, in this government, I can't.
He is. No, he is, and he's one of those. He's one of those who has been involved in WhatsApp conversations with fellow ministers, including Angela Eagle from the Home Office, about what they can do to sort of effectively get around the law.
Well, he would invoke the rule of law left, right and centre on Twitter, Mike. He would cry about it and say the rule of law is being assaulted by the last government. And so it would be with deep irony if he tries to assault the rule of law.
Yes.
This is what the law is. It's what everybody must do. There's no such thing as decriminalisation. Not really. That just means assaulting the rule of law. People need to follow the law. That's all that needs to happen. I think what's going on, Mike, is that we're discovering that there are certain sections of our society who don't want to follow the rules, who don't like rules. And it's quite shocking.
Oh, no, they love rules as long as they don't apply to them.
But I don't understand this at all, Mike, because the old school left, the old school socialists, and the Bennites, and they weren't like this. They didn't used to be. This is not how they were. This isn't in any way. I don't understand where this has come from. The modern left seems to be very narcissistic, seems to not like having any rules at all. Well, I'm terribly sorry. We can't have a functioning society if we don't have rules. So we need them. That's what the rule of law is. We need rules. And this is a rule, and they should follow it.
Right, but it's rather like watching an episode of The Young Ones, isn't it? Where Vivian will just go fascist every time anybody asks him to do anything. And you go, well, actually, no, that's not a fascist remark. It's just, there's a way of operating. There's a rule of doing things. You have to have order in society. And this is now the law. I don't understand why people don't get that.
No, and it's ultimately, we've got to push back against this now, because most of us want to live in a decent society, and I encourage everybody, whether they're left or right or whatever their politics is, to stand with rules and the rule of law, because without it, we're just going to be somewhere really awful. And if our Prime Minister is unable to stand with the rule of law, well, Mike, he's not going to be here forever, but let's the rest of us stand with the rule of law and support it, because it's the only way to have a good and decent society. And as I said, historically, the left did used to stand with the rule of law. In name only, Chris Bryant at least told us he stood with the rule of law. Let's see what he actually does. But this is the law, these are the rules, and we must all apply them, and there's no getting around it.
Yes.
Most of the time, single-sex spaces are going to be lawful, perfectly lawful, and they're not going to include people, even if they've got a gender recognition certificate, if they're the opposite sex.
Quite right. Stephen, very good to talk to you, and very clarifying as well. Thank you very much indeed. Stephen Barrett, a barrister there. The rule of law, it is what it is. You can't just break it. And so, whatever is going to be said this afternoon by the government, and we're not sure who in the government is going to make the statement, we will be a lot clearer about what it is that the government makes of that rule of law, which was handed down by the Supreme Court 6 days ago, last Wednesday.